Colors of Hope, English, make two.
Mr. President, I want to ask you to let my daddy go free because he is good. I haven't seen him in such a long time. He always sends me little drawings and stories. My friends are always asking me for my daddy. I tell them that when you, Mr. President, let my daddy go free, he will take all of us to the park to play ball. Patrick.
From his cell in Argentina, prisoner of conscience Juan Carlos Rodriguez drew these pictures for his son, Patrick. Juan Carlos had been a steel worker, living in the Argentine city of Cordoba. In 1973, he married Marissa, an engineering student. 2 years later, they were arrested, simply because of his work with his union. Today, Juan Carlos, Marissa, and Patrick live in New York City. Not so long ago, they were held with thousands of other political prisoners during Argentina's brutal reign of terror. Patrick was born in prison and taken from his mother when he was 3 months old. The family is together again, but for many years they did not know whether prison or death would separate them forever.
Cuando nos secuestraron,
the day we were kidnapped, my wife and I were having lunch at home. We heard violent banging on the front door of the house. We lived on the corner of the block. We heard noises at the back of the house, looked to see what was going on, and saw people forcing their way in. We knew immediately it was the death squad.
As they came in looking for him, they pushed me to one side. Suddenly, the house was overrun by armed men. I didn't know what was happening.
They almost wrenched the front door off its hinges. They were carrying heavy weapons and pistols. One of them pointed his gun at my head and said, "Juan Carlos, you've lost."
Juan Carlos, perdiste.
Argentina in the 1970s. Violence, terrorism, unstable governments. While the police fought demonstrators in the streets, security forces were rounding up innocent civilians. Union members, journalists, students, and ordinary citizens were taken and held without charge.
They tied us up, dragged us to a car, and threw us on the floor. From this moment, we joined the ranks of the disappeared.
Juan Carlos and Marissa were held incommunicado in one of the many secret detention centers that sprang up across Argentina. No charges were filed, no lawyers were summoned, no one was informed of the arrest.
They wanted names at any cost and would do anything to get them. They wanted names to detain people, to strike a blow against the union. First, they put a plastic bag over my head and held my head in a tank of water, dirty water, until I was nearly asphyxiated. Then they used the picana on me. Electric shocks were applied to my body, to my testicles, and to my mouth.
Then they began to torture me, but I began to lose blood. I didn't know why. I thought it was because of the punches they were giving me. Then they asked me if I was pregnant. I said no, because I didn't know. So they brought in a doctor who examined me and told me that I was pregnant.
I could hear the horrifying screams of the other tortured victims. You don't just suffer while you are being physically tortured, because after your torture session is over, you share the suffering of the other men and women while they are being tortured.
They were tortured for 21 days. Finally, they were charged with subversion and moved to an official prison. They didn't know for how long. They didn't know whether they would ever get out alive.
One morning, some guards took me from my cell with my hands tied behind my back and my head bowed. We walked through the center of the prison towards the entrance, close to where the entry guards were stationed. The guards looked at me with a conspiratorial expression, as if they were up to something, as if they were going to give me a surprise. They looked both threatening and benign. And I saw my wife lie on a stretcher, with a baby at her side still damp from birth. I knelt down beside them to kiss them. I was afraid to lift the baby because babies always seem so fragile. But my wife scolded me a little. "Go ahead," she said, "pick him up." He was a big boy.
And we were able to spend a few minutes together. And he got to know his newborn son. It was 10 or 15 minutes, but to me it seemed like seconds.
And then I returned to the cell block again with my hands tied and my head downcast. I didn't see them for almost a year, almost an entire year, without hearing any news of either my wife or son. When I saw him again, he was a boy with a mop of hair who ran about, who smiled at me. It was rather strange.
March 24th, 1976, the nightmare worsened. In a coup d'etat, the military seized control of the government. No longer hiding behind civilian rule, the military tightened its grip. Repression escalated. They moved directly against the political prisoners. In the prisons, many of the women were living with their children. The military decreed the children must go. Many of the mothers would never see them again. Patrick was 3 months old.
The moment the children were handed over was really tragic. The guards said to us, "Get the children ready, because in 2 hours' time there must not be a single child left in the prison." So we began to prepare our things to hand them over to the guards. It was the only thing we could do. Then a group of guards arrived, about 10 or 15 women guards, and then each of them took one of the babies and its few belongings, clothes and other small things. Then they left with them, and we just watched as they took our children away. We had no idea where they were being taken.
They held us in incommunicado detention for almost a year, with absolutely no contact with anyone. We couldn't even receive letters, much less visits from our families. We had no legal or spiritual assistance.
3 veces me llevaron a un lugar aún peor.
3 times they took me to a place worse even than the prison itself, the punishment block. There they tortured me. My hands were tied with wire which cut the veins in my wrists. In that moment of despair, I thought if I could bleed a bit more, perhaps I could faint, at least faint and lose consciousness. They tried to make us commit suicide. They tried to drive us mad. I remembered my wife. I remembered my son. When I thought about my son, I came to the conclusion, if I die under torture, I hope that someday my son will be proud of his father, who did not give in but died nobly for a just cause.
A brave group of Argentine women, grandmothers and mothers,